I'm going to talk about ranching made profitable, enjoyable, and sustainable. And usually, we understand profitable. We're starting to understand sustainable. Enjoyable is just as important as the other two. What I want to do is I want to challenge you to look outside this box that you've put yourself in. And you can call this, I call it a box, it's a paradigm. It's how we view the world around us. My box is different than yours. Yours is different than your neighbor's, but we're all stuck in our own box. And if we never get up and look out, think outside the box, we get trapped. And it's so easy to be trapped in your box because it's also your comfort zone. We're comfortable in our box. And we really don't want to change anything else. We don't want anything else to change. But the one thing we can count on, things will change. So you need people like me, I need people like you to challenge me to look outside my comfort box, my comfort zone and box, and see things a little different. See what's possible. Our ranch is known as Pharo Cattle Company. It's located on the central high plains of eastern Colorado. This elevation there is about 4,400 feet. It's short grass country, very limited, unpredictable rainfall. When you think of Colorado, many of you have been there, many of you have been on our ranch, but a lot of people, especially in foreign countries, when they think of Colorado, they think of ski resorts, mountains, those sort of things. We can't see the mountains from where we live. There are no mountains, there are no trees. Every tree that's out in eastern Colorado was planted and watered. And there's no running water. There's very few people. So, there's some advantages out there. We started out in the early 1980s as commercial producers. We were able to lease a fairly sizable herd of cows, lease some land, and get back to the area where both Deanna and I grew up. And it didn't take long, and with the guidance of a few friends who were smarter than me, we decided, the industry, the beef industry at that time, this is 1980, was headed in the wrong direction. And we knew what we thought we needed to do is opposite of what the industry was doing. The industry, for the most part, was trying to make their cattle as big as it could. It was a race. The race was on. I mean, it didn't take long, when that's after all the exotic breeds came in from Europe, the continental breeds. And I remember how big those cattle were. And from that point on, the English breeds that we were more familiar with, the Herefords, the Red Angus, the Black Angus, decided they needed to catch up. And about probably 8 years ago, they did catch up. The biggest cows in North America now are not Gelbvieh, Charolais, Simmental. They're Angus, Red Angus, and Hereford. But anyway, that was the race that we could see the industry's on. We didn't want to do that. We instead of increasing cow size, we wanted to increase pounds and profit per acre or per hectare. But because we couldn't find the genetics that we wanted, it was impossible to find somebody else that thought like us because we were already way outside the box, the herd. So we decided we would become that seed stock producer or stud breeder. Might be a more familiar term for you guys. Our first bull sale in 1991, we sold 6 bulls. We now sell bulls, mostly Angus, quite a few Red Angus, Hereford, and a couple of different composites. And for the last 10 years, we've sold 800 to 1,000 bulls a year. So what we were doing clear back in the 80s eventually kind of started making sense to commercial producers. Most of the industry, and I refer to the industry as status quo, most of them are still trying to out-Simmental the Simmentals. But more and more people are catching on to what we're doing. I want to start with this quote: agriculture that is not profitable and enjoyable will never be sustainable. a lot of times we think, okay, we're ranching for the lifestyle. And a lot of people in America are. And probably some here too. But just because it's a lifestyle doesn't mean it's sustainable if it's not profitable. And there are a few people making money at ranching. You know, I don't remember if it was Canada or Australia, but I went through customs once and they asked me what I was going to be speaking about. I said, I'm going to speak to a group of cattlemen. And I said, ranching made profitable. I said, isn't that an oxymoron? It's not. But it has to be both of those to be sustainable. It has to be both of those for the next generation to say, I like what we're doing here. I want to come back. Now, I'd like to ask the audience about now, what do you think the average age of cow-calf producers in Australia is? 58, 60. David, what did you tell me before? 64. David acts like he knows what he's talking about, so I always go with that. The rest of you are quietly guessing. So 64, that's about the same as it is in the U.S. And I get to thinking, when I think of that, I say, okay, most of people of my age, that age, in the U.S. are retiring. And, you know, there's a lot of people 64, 65, 66, they've got their retirement all set up. Now, I'm not going to retire until I have to retire, so that doesn't matter to me. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the average age of cow-calf producers is close to retirement age. So where's the next generation? Why aren't they coming into the family business? I don't know for sure, but I suspect it may have something to do with, do I have a red light here? Apparently, well, it's a little bitty one. Has something to do with profit and enjoyment. You know, ranchers in America try to do everything. They try to make it as hard as they can. You know, we're going to calve in a snowstorm. We're going to, you know, we're going to feed as much feed as we can do. We're just going to work real hard and not make any money. And the next generation says, you know, I can go to town and get a 40-hour-a-week job and make 10 times, 20 times that much. So I think that's a key for what we're going to talk about today. My neighbor Earl, sitting on that obsolete tractor, says, no, I ain't thought much about retirement. I'm going to just keep working till I'm finished going broke. That's not really funny, is it? It's funny because there's too much truth involved there. And in ourselves. You know, hell, I won't tell that one. I will tell another one, though, because I'll forget it later. Every time I hear David talk about average is like a unicorn, there is no such thing. And Bart said something similar. Where's Bart? So every time I hear somebody say that, I want to jump up and tell them what my definition of average is. The average person has one testicle and one boob, but you don't see that very often. But talking a little bit about average, there is no such thing, whether it's the weather, the markets, anything. I mean, you just can't depend on average. That's where we get caught in our comfort zone. We say, okay, if I could just get rain at this time, you know, we're real comfortable, but it's never going to be that way. And things will change. And we'll talk about change here a little bit too. Much has changed in the last 50 years. Do you think ranching is as profitable today as it was 50 years ago? No. And as either you or Terry showed that slide, ranchers were much more profitable 50 years ago than they are today. And I'm going to answer that here. For a few people, ranching is more profitable. These are the unique people that know how to do all the right things. There's not many of them, kind of like the average person. They're unique. Most cow-calf producers today are doing good just to break even. In the U.S., way over half of them aren't breaking even. And there's a good reason for that. Most cow herds in the U.S. are so small, they weren't even designed to make money. You know, they're subsidized by outside income, and, you know, we don't have to make money on these. So, you know, if you can break even in a 10-year period, you're doing better than average. Okay, why is that? I'm going to share a couple of my thoughts, and I'm sure there's other reasons. For the past 50 years, input costs have risen 4 times faster than cattle prices. That's tough to get around, isn't it? Input costs have risen 4 times faster than inputs for the last 50 years. Cattle prices, I mean. And I believe input costs are going to pretty much keep increasing. I mean, there may be some drop in crude oil prices and things like that. For the most part, I think we're going to see this thing just keep going. What do you think? So that's something that's making it hard to be profitable today. So we're going to have to learn how to ranch with fewer inputs. Almost no inputs would be great. The other thing is, for the last 50 years, cattlemen around the world, you guys are just as bad as we are in the U.S., have bred and selected almost exclusively to increase weaning weights. Don't deny it. That's the paradigm we all grew up in. When I went back to the ranch in 1980, you know, that was the thing that I could say, okay, this does not make sense. And when you pencil it out, it does not make sense. And that's why we said, okay, we're going to stop this. It doesn't matter how big your cattle are if they're not profitable. So that's hard to, you know, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but let me tell you why they've been very successful at doing that. You know, I think we've almost doubled our weaning weights in the last 50 or 60 years in the U.S. Sure didn't double our profits. As a result of this incessant selection for bigger and bigger weaning weights, this is what we see happening. Bragging rights have increased. That's the only positive I see here. And there's a lot of that going on in the U.S. I don't know how it is here. But I mean, that's what we live for, or some people live for, is bragging rights. They're fun, but you can't buy any groceries with them. You're not going to send the kids to college with bragging rights. Number 2, because we're selecting for bigger and bigger weaning weights, cow size has increased. Cows in the U.S. are about 40% bigger than they were 40 years ago. They eat more. They still only produce 1 calf. And we'll talk a little more about that later. Because cow size has increased, stocking rates have decreased, and the cost of production has increased. All negative except the first one. And as a result of all that, profits have also decreased. I mean, you're fighting an uphill battle doing what we're talking about doing here. I believe, and I have believed for some time, that the beef industry is at a major turning point. What's worked so well for the last 20 years, you guys all figured that out, won't work for the next 20 years. Those who are the quickest to adapt and change will be in the driver's seat. I know several of those people are here today. They're changing, and they stopped selecting for the wrong things. They're using less inputs. Those who are slowest to change are going to get left behind and run over, and they should be. You know, I think in America, if we could get the government out of farming, we'd have less farmers, or less farmers that don't know how to make a profit. I'm sure there's some of you here that are going to it's going to be a struggle to keep up. And that all depends on your willingness to change. If you have no willingness to change, it's going to be tough. So let's talk about accepting change. If I ask for a show of hands, how many of you like change? At least 3 or 4 of you raise your hands. Don't do it. because you're lying. We don't like change. We're creatures of habit. We like our comfort box, our comfort zone. We don't want to even look outside and see what's possible. You know, the times I take, some of you know, I send out weekly emails and quarterly newsletters, and when I upset the largest number of people is when I tell them they can do better than they're doing. They don't want to know that. They're happy right there in that comfort zone, and they would rather fail doing things the way they've always done it than succeed because it involves change. We don't like change. We're creatures of habit. Most industries, innovation is accepted and implemented in 17 months. Let's say I'm manufacturing computers in my shop building, and some little explosion or something happens, and all of a sudden I found a way to make a much better, much faster computer for half the price. Now, when I start doing this, if the rest of the industry that's making computers, who makes most of the computers you buy here? Jonah? I don't understand your language. China. Okay. If the other companies don't adopt and practice what I'm doing, I'm going to leave them back. It's a dog-eat-dog world. 17 to 24 months. On the other hand, cow-calf producers in the cow-calf business, it usually takes 17 to 24 years. And when I say innovation to be accepted, that's a proven idea. That's something that I proved will work, you proved will work, and yet it's going to take us 24 years, 17 to 24 years to put it in practice. Is there anybody here that disagrees with that? That's sad, isn't it? What does that say about us? That's right. Agriculture advances one funeral at a time. That's part of the problem, and that's probably the main part. I don't know. I think there's several things there. We in agriculture hate to leave our comfort zones almost worse than anybody else. And somehow we can stay in there and stay in business even though we're only breaking even for a long time. Most businesses can't do that. But for the most part, most farms and ranches, stations, properties are multi-generational. 2 or 3 generations are usually getting their income from this property. Grandpa may have moved to town. He's not doing much anymore, but that's where his income has to come from. The young buck that's out there doing most of the work is living and working in his dad's or maybe even his granddad's paradigm. I mean, he sees a different world. They see their world, and they're not going to look outside that box. Now, we talked about average age. Who checked most of these people in? Tricia? Where's she at? In the back. There you are. What do you think the average age of these people are? Old? Did you say? It's a lot younger than 64. Maybe not a lot, but it's younger. We need more Maddies. But I hear people my age. I'm 66. We'll be 67 this year. I hear people my age says, "Well, what's wrong with the next generation? They're just too lazy to work." No, they're too smart to do what you've been doing. There's a lot of cattlemen in the U.S. work a 40-hour-a-week job and then work 40 hours on the weekend to take care of their cows that aren't going to make any money. A lot of times, Dad and Grandpa will say, whenever Maya Grazing put this meeting together, say, I just read about this meeting. Why they send Junior to the meeting? And Junior said, yeah, I'd be happy to go. And he starts listening to the people that spoke today, and he says, this is a little different than what Granddad and Dad talk about. And he gets more and more excited. He can't wait to get home and tell his dad. When he tells his dad a few of the things he learns, what happens? Yeah, that won't work here. Throw cold water in his face. How many times can you do that to Junior before he says, this is crap, I'm leaving? And if Junior has a wife, it won't take that long, because Mrs. Junior sees what's going on and says, you're still going to be a hired man when you're 55 years old. And that's what's wrong, part of what's wrong with this industry. Okay, I know that I tend to be this way. I know you tend to be this way, but we need to be smarter and say, okay, let's contradict that and say, it doesn't have to be that way. In my business, we're going to do things different. You can dare to be a herd quitter. Now somebody, I think he's a reporter, said, I don't know what a herd quitter is, but I'm going to find out. A herd quitter is someone who has enough courage to break away from the status quo herd mentality way of thinking. It's more about thinking for yourself than anything else. Now, I know all of you think you're rugged individuals, do your own thinking. That's a lie, too. We're the most herd-bound industry that I know of. Now, maybe you aren't, but I'll bet you your neighbors are. But they don't think they are. As long as we're following the crowd, doing what everybody else is doing, as long as we're in the status quo, we're not thinking for ourselves. We're too lazy or afraid to think for ourselves, so we let somebody else do it. As long as you're doing that, you'll never, ever, ever be above average. Think about that. Average is losing money in this business. We have to be better than average, or we're not going to have a business to pass on to the next generation if we figure that out. Had another little thought there, but it just slipped away. So I'll just keep moving on. Profit equals income minus expenses. That's basic economics 101. We don't talk about this much. Now, RCS talks about it a lot, but the reason people don't come to a lot of grazing seminars or things like this is because it's not sexy enough. This isn't sexy enough. We like to talk about our big weaning weights because that's sexy. This isn't sexy, but it's critical. My production, sorry. My profit is dependent on what I produce times its value minus my expenses. Most of us don't have much control over the markets or the prices we receive. Some of us do. But most cattlemen don't, so we're going to talk about these two things: reducing expenses, increasing production. Now, reducing expenses, most of you, or most of the groups I talk about, I says you need to find expenses you can totally eliminate. You can only reduce so far. You can't reduce any more, but we all have expenses we can eliminate if we think about it. If you don't have any expenses you can eliminate and the expenses continue to go up like this, you just as well sell out now while somebody else is there to buy your place. Now let's talk about production. And I struggle with this in a little bit. When I talk about increasing production, what's the average cow-calf producer think of? Increased weaning weights. So this is how I'm going to do it. Increasing production is a great way to increase profits. Now I'm going to yell at you. but only if you increase production per hectare, not animal. And increasing production per hectare it's wide open. When you stop thinking about increasing production per cow, it's amazing what we can do. And we'll talk about that some. I think this is a slide I just put in this morning. Johan Zeitsman, who is a rancher consultant from Zimbabwe, says if corn farmers thought the same way that cow-calf producers think, and this is around the world, this isn't just in Australia or America, around the world, they would plant very few plants per acre or hectare. And they would try to get the most pounds of corn per plant. Now, does that make sense? What have you guys been doing? It's the same thing. Trying to get the most pounds per cow is no different than what this guy in the foreground is doing. Look at the background, though. This guy says, okay, I'm going to get the most pounds and profit per hectare, not per plant or per cow. Soak that in a little bit. Because I guarantee you, you may not be doing it now, but everyone in here has done that and is probably still doing it. And I tell people, I truly believe that most cow-calf producers can actually double their profits once they start or stop thinking about the wrong things, focusing on the wrong things. Profit per cow is not going to do it any more than pounds per plant. Many ranches in America that were put together and paid for with 350-pound calves are now struggling and going broke with 600-pound calves. They were profitable back there with those little calves. They were doing things right, and we didn't have to, the inputs were as high. For the last 50 years, the beef industry has been focused on increasing individual weaning weights when they should have been focused on increasing pounds and profit per hectare. Total big difference there. When you, I think I remember what I was thinking about before. When you purchase bulls, most of you are calf producers, not all of you, but when you go out and purchase bulls, I could pretty much guarantee you're selecting for going to increase. How many of you use growth EBVs? Oh, you don't have to show hands. I really don't. I'd be ashamed to raise my hand. You're selecting for bragging rights. I don't know, most ranchers in America have a good relationship with their banker. I don't know about you guys. But I've challenged Americans, I said, go ask your banker if he wants you to select for bragging rights or profit. Because there's a difference. You cannot select for bigger and bigger weaning weights without your profit going down. Is that right, David? We have people that measure these things. Okay, I showed this at Rock the other day. I haven't shown this for some time, but sometimes we need a visualization to reinforce some thinking. This is a picture of my dad in the 1950s. My dad was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. He was a city kid, wanted to be a cowboy or a rancher. He eventually moved to eastern Colorado. He had a very small herd of cows and a job in town. His job in town was a range conservationist. He had been trained to do that. Dad did not grow up on a ranch, I think was a positive. I think Maddie said the same thing about her. Grew up in Sydney, and that's a positive. We're not tied to some stupid family traditions. We can think for ourselves. And my dad was like that. I inherited that from my dad. My sons inherited that from me. So there's some valuable times I spent with my dad. I learned a lot from him, not only, grass management and those sort of things, but just in general. I mean, he saw things different in ranching than everybody else. I remember riding across a pasture one day. That's something that every father should do with their sons, and it doesn't happen often enough. But I remember him we just walked. Well, here's what he said. You can only produce so many pounds of beef from an acre of grass or a hectare of grass. You're going to notice today that I don't convert everything to kilograms or hectares or however else. And I'm looking out there. You guys are smart enough to get the gist anyway. And it's more a function of rainfall than anything else. Now, it took me probably 30 years to truly understand what he's saying, and it shouldn't have. But what he's saying, if we just kind of back management out, we have some cows and some land. And really, we don't do anything with them. I mean, we don't plan, we don't have grazing charts, we don't do anything. We just kind of let the cows and the land and the rain take care of it. On years, let's say this is a hectare, this tent is. On a good year, you get more rain, you're going to produce more beef, right? On a bad year, you're going to produce less beef. That's all he's saying. But I'm going to take it a step farther and say, okay, let's assume that I have a small ranch. And this small ranch will produce in an average year, you know what average is. You don't see that very often. In an average year, my small ranch is going to produce 25,000 kilograms of beef or calves. So I want to give you two choices. 25,000 kilograms, the reason those truck pictures are there, that's about what we can put in a truck in America. I mean, that's a truckload of calves, whether they weigh 400 or 180 kilograms or 270 kilograms. So I'm going to give you that choice and say, which truck is worth more? One of them has 180 kilogram calves, one of them has 270 kilogram calves. Which truck is worth more? The one on the left? Yes. Year in and year out, that truck's worth $10,000 to $15,000 more than the one on the right. So why are you working so hard to produce those bigger calves? You're not? No, the market demands it? Yeah. They want bigger calves. Do you get paid for bigger calves? Apparently not. This truck's worth more. Well, we're thinking. I want to stop. I just want you to look at that. And in actuality, well, let me back up. I don't want you to go home and say, I got it figured out now. If I just wean my calves when they're smaller, I'm going to make more money. Not going to work that way. This situation over here, I mean, it took a few years to get there, but this ranch has more cows, producing more calves that don't weigh as much per calf. And in reality, and we'll talk about this later, in reality, these cows here will actually produce more than this truck over here. The cows over here are able to wean a higher percentage of their own weight, and therefore, not only do you have more cows than the stocking rate, but they're producing more for their weight. So it's something that you don't just take your big cows and wean your calves small and make money doing that. There's an adjustment there. Stocking rate. Stocking rate affects profitability or lack thereof more than anything else. Now, I didn't convert these pounds to kilograms. Actually, I did, but I forgot to put that slide in. So it's somewhere else. But that doesn't matter. Somebody tell me real quick what a 1,000-pound cow is. 450. And a 1,400-pound? 640. So I can have 100 head of 450-kilogram cows as compared to 71 head of 640-kilogram cows. I'm just trying to get you to picture some of this. And over the last 50 years, because we, as an industry, have selected for more and more weaning weight, we've ended up with more and more cows like this. Okay, I'd like to compare the average producer with a low input producer. And again, the average producer is basically losing money, but this will just show him breaking even. The black wavy line there represents calf prices for the cattle cycle. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, and prior to that, that was very predictable in the States. I assume that yours maybe followed along somewhat. But every 10 years, we would be up on top. Every 10 years, we'd be down here. You could count on that, and you could make money at the top and the bottom, because it's just going to happen. We haven't been down here at the bottom in the U.S. since 1996. So we've been kind of floating around. The prices have gone up and down a little bit, but we have not seen a true bottom since 1996. So the cycle has somewhat broken, but it's still there. It's just not as predictable now. The red line represents the average producer. On a good year, prices are high, he's making money. On a bad year, he's losing about the same amount. There are more people than you can imagine that are no better than that. Some in here. That's a break-even rancher, wouldn't you say? I know cow-calf producers that have done this for generations, for decades, and they're still doing it. If you take a business in town, let's say a restaurant, how long can it break even? Not very long. What makes us so unique? Equity? Subsidy? You don't get subsidies. If your wife works in town, you're getting subsidized. A good friend of mine says the secret to being a successful rancher is a wife with a really good job. I think, you know, number one, we're stubborn and we're smart. You know, we know that when we make all this money here, we better not spend it all, because we also know what this is coming next. So we save some money. And in the U.S., there's a lot of subsidizing going on. And there's a lot of cow herds, like I said, that are so small they weren't even supposed to be profitable. So they never will be. The blue line down here represents the low input producers. These are the guys that have eliminated as many expenses as they think they can, and they've reduced other expenses. It's not, in this case here, it's not that they're making more money, it's they're spending less money. The easiest money you're ever going to make is the money you do not spend. And you don't have to pay taxes on it. The most profitable ranchers that I know of have one thing in common. Without exception, they strive to make the most efficient use of the forage resources on their ranch. In other words, let's back up a step. They strive to make the most of every ray of sunshine and drop of rain that hits the land they control. That's where it's all at. Solar energy and rain. And most of the talks you heard today we know what it is to be without rain, but we can prepare for it. We can manage our grazing. We can do things that will make it better for us. Bart said, his opening said, being ready is a choice. Is that how you said it? Being ready is a choice. Being prepared is a choice. You know, that's not just about rain. That's about a lot of things. This involves what I call the 3 keys. Number 1, planned rotational grazing. Now, we can call that a lot of things. This is what I tend to like to call it. I used to just say rotational grazing, but if there's no plan involved, you're just moving cows, it's not going to work. And we listened to some really smart people talking about this already today. Number 2, matching your production cycle to your forage resources. And number 3, matching cow size and type to your forage resources. So we're going to talk about those one at a time. I'm sure that because you're here, there's no one in this room that has not heard about planned rotational grazing. You've heard about it. Some of you aren't doing it, but you've heard about it. And I'm pretty sure that all of your neighbors have heard about it. If you have a grazing school, if you hire some of these guys to come teach a grazing school for you, how many of your neighbors would show up? Not very many. It's not sexy enough. I'm just going to tell you some brief things about what we've experienced. In 1994, we put in some water lines, we put in some cross fences, and we started rotational grazing. Simply put, that means putting all of our cattle together in one large herd, rotating them through a series of smaller pastures. And I know most of you are way beyond what I'm talking about, but maybe some of you aren't. And sometimes I can say something in a different way than you've heard before. My first rule of thumb is to move cattle fast when the grass is growing fast, slow when the grass is growing slow. That doesn't seem too complicated, but I'm amazed. And when I was in Rocky, I talked to two people didn't get that. I mean, they started rotating cattle, but they didn't know how they were doing it or why they were doing it. And I said, who did you learn from? Oh, we read a little bit and we talked to the neighbors. And, you shouldn't build any fence until you know what you're doing. But I look at this and a lot of people say that just doesn't make sense. When it's growing back fast, leave them longer. You're not hurting it. Let's pretend that my hand is a grass plant. When we open a gate, a cow comes in there, she chomps that off. Now, if I have sufficient moisture, that grass plant's going to start growing back almost immediately. The more moisture I have, the faster it grows back. Before another cow can eat it again, or even think about eating it, the cows have to be moved. So the reason I'm saying this is we want a long rest period between when that grass plant's eaten the first time and it's eaten the second time. And during that rest period, it's growing roots, it's growing leaves or solar collectors. That's how this system works. Second rule of thumb is to put the highest number of cattle in the smallest possible area for the shortest period of time. When you do this, you're going to maximize your rest periods. You're going to maximize your production, grass production and beef production, and you're going to maximize your profits. The thing about this one, we're all different. Our programs are different. Our lifestyle is different. I know people that are moving cows several times a day. They make money to do it. I know people that wouldn't move cows more than once, maybe twice a week if it's a really good year. Doesn't really matter, but that principle applies. Those that have worked the hardest at it are going to get the most out of it. I don't know if anybody here, probably nobody here has ever heard of Chad Peterson. Used to live in Nebraska, now he lives in Montana. But Chad took what we call mob grazing to the extreme. He did amazing things with terrible land. Changed the land, increased the number of cattle, the pounds and everything. And he, just out of curiosity, wanted to see what happened if he moved cows every 20 minutes. Round the clock. So what we're talking about, we've got a large herd of cows that are probably just moving in and something that they fit in. They put their heads down a little bit and they move again. He was doing amazing things, but he said, I'd rather go water skiing than move cows. So, you have to, you can't let this rule you. Some of the reasons that have done this, and there's more, but to start out with, reduce and eliminate expenses or supplemental feeding. A typical rancher in eastern Colorado feeds at least 2 tons of hay per cow a year and protein. I don't remember when we first moved down there, we looked around, we saw what other people are doing, and that's kind of what we mimicked until we said, none of this is making sense. So I was there for about 10 years before we were able to put this into play, but we eliminated almost all hay feeding. The only time we feed hay is when the snow is deep or hard. So you know that winter feeding in the U.S. and I don't, you know, I'm sure there's parts of Australia the same way, but that's our biggest expense. Would that be the biggest expense for most cattlemen here, David? No. What would it be?
The cost of land would be labor. The biggest thing that costs me.
Labor.
Long periods of feed, unless somebody's being in a big feeding program because of drought.
Okay. It's a big deal for us, so you know what, we eliminated that. The other thing, improve the rangeland. We want to improve the forage quantity, more grass, quality, and diversity. You know, we're growing grasses within 2 years of starting this. We were seeing species that I didn't think existed out there. They've been there all along. They never had a chance to rest and grow. You know, the cows would just chomp them off. Increase beef production per acre, and that's where it's at, or hectares. You have to think hectare when I say acre. If you're selecting for bigger and bigger weaning weights, can you do that? If you're selecting for bigger and bigger weaning weights, you don't have a very good grazing system because you want bigger weaning weights, not total weight. This is huge. But you've got to stop focusing on the wrong thing. You can manage this, you know, very unintensely and increase your beef and grass production by 50%. Those guys that are moving cattle a lot more often, maybe 200, 300, 400, 500%. Now, when you think about that, that's huge. Once again, stocking rate affects profitability or lack thereof more than anything else. Some of you have probably heard of Greg Judy if you get the Stockman Grass Farmer, and I know several of you do. And this was taken several years ago. But Greg Judy says, mob grazing's made it possible for me to double my grass production. He says, that's like having someone give you another farm for free. If you would ask him today, it would be way more than double. The longer you're at it, the more it's working for you. You know, this is in Missouri, and a lot of the water sources for these cattle in Missouri were dugout ponds. About 2 years into this, he had to start piping water because no water ever reached the ponds. It grew grass instead of running off. This is Mashona cattle in Florida, mob grazing. Deanna and I were there in 2012. And that's about what it looked like then. That land was a tree farm, and they grew trees in pots, big pots. So the land, actual land, was sprayed with Roundup every year. We never grew anything on it, and it didn't have an ounce of organic matter, no bugs, no microbes, no anything. But with very intensive. They were moving cattle about 5 times a day. And you can kind of see how tight they are. I mean, with that type of grazing, they changed that land in about 4 years. Is that got a back fence on it? No. No, they just stay on fresh grass. Yeah. No, I mean, sometimes you may need a back fence, but in this case, there's not much to go back to. Okay, this is a customer of ours in northern Utah. They get this 10 inches of snow, temperatures from 0 to 30 below. I don't know what that is Celsius, but zero would be 0. No, your zeros are plus 32. So this is cold. We will agree on that. But every day he moves those cows, and they graze through the snow. When the cows are done at the end of the day, you don't see any snow. I mean, it just looked like brown out there. And he makes a decision, you know, if the cows got full a little early and quit, you know, he'll give them a little less the next day. Or a little more the next day if they act like they're hungry. This is in the part of ranch country in the U.S. where they would run their cows up on these hills, higher country during the summertime, while the cows are up there grazing. The ranchers down here where these cows are, this is what they call a hay meadow. It's like a sub-irrigated hay meadow. They're down there making and hauling hay all summer. Guess what they do all winter? Feed hay. Right there, same place. This makes a whole lot more sense. And this is a picture of a ranch Tyson and I visited in Old Mexico, the Las Damas Ranch. And we visited 5 ranches down there who had been practicing holistic management practices for at least 4 years. One of them was 28 years. One of them was the first one in North America to practice savory type grazing. But this is Alejandro's, Alejandro's land on this side of the fence, and this is his neighbor this side. Ranches are about similar in size. Neighbor thinks Alejandro gets more rain. What do you think? Alejandro's running about 600 cows year-round, no hay, no nothing. He doesn't even put out salt and mineral. Now, I think that might be taken a little bit too far, but that's what he does, and he's getting away with it. This guy runs 100 cows year-round and feeds at least 6 months out of the year. They both looked about the same when they started. Now, my math isn't very good. 600, 100, I said that's 600%. David tells me that's 1,200%. He's probably right. But that's when we talk about stocking rate and what we can do. You can't do this if you're focusing on increasing weaning weights. It's not going to prevent you to go there because you're going to say, well, my weaning weights are getting smaller. So all of a sudden you start going backwards. I don't know what this guy's focused on. It'll be survival before long. Yeah. Okay, most of you can relate to this. Earl says, no, Ed, we ain't overstocked, we're just under-rained. I've heard people say this, it doesn't matter how much rain you get, how much do you keep? And you people with rotational grazing systems are keeping a lot more rain than your neighbors.